If you want.
Good evening, everyone. We have a very full house tonight, but we also want to be very prompt because we're streaming and we probably have a few hundred people watching us on YouTube tonight. So thank you all so very much for joining us, and welcome to the Concord Museum. I'm Lisa Krasner, the Edward W. Kane Executive Director. And tonight we're here in the Churchill and Janet Franklin Lyceum, and I also want to welcome all of our virtual viewers as well. It's a pleasure for me to introduce tonight's forum, which is a conversation with Professor Leila Philipp and Professor Richard Primack to discuss Professor Philipp's new book, Beaverland, How One Weird Rodent Made America. Publishers Weekly called Beaverland a triumph of popular nature writing, and is a book that highlights through history and contemporary storytelling how this unusual rodent has played an oversized role in American history and continues to feature in its future. As we love to tie everything back to Concord here at the museum, Henry David Thoreau considered beavers to be one of the nobler animals that were exterminated from the area in his time. We'll hear tonight about the inspiring story of the conservation efforts that brought the beaver back. Now they happily live in Concord, including at Fairyland Pond, where Thoreau frequently walked when traveling between Emerson's house and Walden Pond. So let me introduce our speakers. So Leila Philipp is an American writer, poet, and educator. She's the author of award-winning books of nonfiction, which have received glowing national reviews. In addition to Beaverland, her books include A Family Place, A Hudson Valley Farm, 3 Centuries, 5 Wars, 1 Family, Hidden Dialogue, a discussion between women in Japan and the United States, The Road Through Myanmar, and 1 collection of poetry as well. So Professor Philipp graduated cum laude from Princeton University with a Bachelor of Arts in Comparative Literature and earned a 5th-year degree in East Asian Studies. She earned an MFA in Fiction and Nonfiction at Columbia University as the Woolrich Fellow in Writing, and she has received numerous awards for her writing, including fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Professor Philipp has taught at a number of universities, including Princeton, Columbia, Vassar, and Colgate, and is currently a professor of creative writing and literature in the English department at the College of the Holy Cross. Fluent in Japanese, she writes in Japan as well about art for a variety of venues, including Art in America and Art Critica. So Richard Primack is a professor of plant ecology at Boston University with research interest in conservation biology, climate change biology, citizen science, and tropical rainforests. He has published over 200 scientific papers and carried out extensive fieldwork in Malaysia, New Zealand, Japan, Central America, United States, as well as other countries. For the past 21 years, Professor Primack and his colleagues have been investigating the effects of a warming climate on the plants and birds of Massachusetts, with an emphasis on continuing the observations made 160 years ago by Henry David Thoreau in Concord. Professor Primack has been involved in educating the public about the effects of climate change through public talks and popular writing, including a book about his work, Walden Warming, Climate Change Comes to Thoreau's Woods. His work has often been featured in the popular press, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Public Radio, and National Geographic magazine. So many of you will remember the Concord Museum's 2013 exhibition, Early Spring, Henry Thoreau and Climate Change, in which Professor Primack contributed as a guest scholar. We're excited to work with him on an upcoming exhibition, Harvest Seasons, and look forward to welcoming all of you to the upcoming exhibit and related programming this fall. So that'll open up this fall. So thank you so very much for joining us, and please join me in welcoming Leila Philipp and Richard Primack.
Mine's on, okay. We didn't decide which one of us is going to talk first. You should say something.
I think you're supposed to ask the questions, but I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for coming and for having me.
Well, I just want to say that a couple of weeks ago when I was invited to moderate this session, I thought, well, I already know a lot about beavers. What am I going to learn from reading this book, Beaverland? And I was pleasantly surprised that as I read the book, I kept learning more facts about beavers and more information, more stories about beavers than I had known. So it's really a wonderful book, and I'm really glad that I had the chance to read it. in my classes, we always talk about beavers as being ecosystem engineers, of changing the environment. But one of the things I think are really a major theme through the book, which I hadn't really appreciated, is that they're not only changing the environment, but they're also potentially changing it in a way which will help us deal with climate change. And so I think that for me, that was like a most important theme. I was wondering if you could just tell people a little bit about, why beavers are so important in terms of dealing with the upcoming crisis of climate change.
Oh, great question. So, okay, I could speak for probably like an hour about this, but first of all, beavers really did make America. So they jump-started our first economies with the fur trade, and they shaped the river system. So to understand why they can help us so much with climate change right now, with all the problems we have with this whiplash weather pattern where we get too much rain and then we get a drought where we have not enough water. We really need to understand that we have a river system that is struggling with a loss of wetlands and highly degraded. So beavers are essential to a healthy river ecology, and it's one of the things that I really wanted to share with readers, because it's one of the things that I learned researching the book, and it was just incredible to learn what this little rodent, this quirky little rodent, like 36 inches tall, the profound role that they play in the health of the river system. So, and I should say, the indigenous peoples who have always lived here have long understood the value of beavers, and it's one of the reasons why I opened the book with the story of the great beaver, and maybe we can talk about that later. But to go back to climate change, so flooding, drought, dwindling supplies of groundwater, beavers they'll go to a creek system or a stream somewhere along the river network, and they will build a dam. So that previously thin line of water swells into a pond. And that's just the beginning. So there's a visible basin of water that you can see, but underneath the soil is an invisible sponge of water. And this is where it gets really exciting and really interesting really fast, because every beaver pond that you might see out there in the woodlands here, say in the Northeast, holds at least 3 times as much water underneath as you can see. So the math gets pretty exciting. So imagine those little beaver ponds holding 3 times as much water under the soil. So that's a huge sponge of water that's there, ready to hydrate the stream system when the drought comes. And it's also a huge sponge that's there when we get a huge rain event to absorb that flood water. So that's why beaver wetlands are so important. They're sponges that absorb floodwater, and they're sponges of water that are reserves that help hydrate the system when it dries out and when we get extreme heat and drought. And not only that, we need to think about those sponges maybe like coffee filters, because they cleanse the water as it goes down. So each of those wetlands is slowing down the water so it can go down through the wetland, be cleansed, so that when it enters the aquifer, it's cleansed of things like nitrogen and phosphorus, really bad pollutants that we need to get out of the water system. In addition, sediment. So, I could go on. I'm really kind of a beaver geek, but these are really, really big problems we face, and beavers are out there just dealing with those things all the time.
So one thing interesting about your book, which I had appreciated for the first time, was the fact that we're often building these large flood control systems. So at great expense, at millions of dollars or tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, we're building dams and systems to control flooding. But if we just had a lot of beavers on the landscape, they would be doing the same thing for free.
Well, yeah, we need to think about beavers as like highly trained furry engineers out there working. But of course, it's not as simple as that, because we are living in a lot of places where the river used to be and wants to be. But we're not going to move Hartford, we're not going to move Manhattan, we're not going to move a lot of our infrastructure. So beavers can't be everywhere. But once North America was Beaverland, once there were an estimate of 400 million beavers at work in the river system in every watershed, slowing the water down, managing it, spreading it out, so that we need to think of the river system more like a circulatory system that pulsed water through the land. And we harnessed it and used it for power and transportation and energy because we needed to. But now we need to start thinking about how to return some of the healthy river function if we're going to face all these problems we have with climate change. Because, we see it here in the East with flooding. We see it with then drought. We actually have dwindling supplies of groundwater, which is hard to imagine because we get so much rain in the summer. But if it rushes through the stream system and goes out into the ocean and we don't capture it, it doesn't really matter how much rain we get. So this is something that river scientists talk about, and I had so much fun researching this book and tromping around after river scientists and learning about this. And I really can't emphasize enough how much nature-based restoration, which is the term for this in the environmental restoration world, really has to offer us. Because engineered solutions cost a lot, and we're not going to have enough money for engineered solutions everywhere. So at one point in the book, I write about the Chesapeake, where there's a wonderful guy down there. His code name is the Beaver Whisperer. And he runs a very successful environmental restoration company. And I was tromping around in the swamps with him, and he would just point casually and say, look at that 8-acre beaver pond. I could build you water storage like that, cost you $1 million, and these beavers are doing it for free. So wherever beavers can do this work, let's have them do it. It just makes sense, and I think that's why kind of the, quote, so-called beaver believer movement is turning from a kind of fringe movement to really a mainstream way of thinking for municipalities and towns and highway departments, because saving money is just in everybody's interest. So
I think that the Chesapeake Bay example is very powerful for me, because in my writings, I often talk about Chesapeake Bay and how much hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent by the federal government to clean up Chesapeake Bay and reduce the pollution, and it's basically not working. I mean, they're building all these water treatment plants and river restoration projects, but if they just encourage beavers, that they could be potentially achieving the same ends at a much lower cost.
Well, I think, the truth is there's probably room for both, and there's a need for both. Like, we're not going to solve all our problems with beavers, but we have a lot of open space that we're not utilizing properly for beavers. Out west in states like Utah, Oregon, Washington, California, there are really large-scale beaver restoration programs utilizing beavers, harnessing beavers going on. In California, a big concern is wildfire. So getting beavers up into the watershed to build resiliency for wildfire is a big impetus, but also flood control. California was just hit with terrible flooding. Mm-hmm. So Utah, same, trying to restore some of the resiliency to the rivers. But out here in the East, we have so much open woodland, and a lot of it is really, if we could be better at coexisting with beavers. I think a lot of it is education, not knee-jerk trapping them out because they're bringing water to the wrong place, but taking a minute to see, can we figure out a way to coexist with them? Can we put in a pond leveler and control the water? Unfortunately, here in the East, we can't move beavers across within the state or across state lines. Out west, you can do that. Mm-hmm. So if you have a problem beaver, like in your yard, you can't give it to me and say, hey, I want a beaver. Can't do that here, unfortunately.
So I also just want to mention another very large theme in your book, which is the relationship of Native Americans to beavers and the fact that they really valued beavers. So it's a case where they regarded beavers as a sacred animal, but also underlying this was they recognized that the beavers provided so much to them. So could the how did the Native Americans see the value of beavers? They recognized that the beavers provided them with fish and hunting grounds, and is that what it was? Did they explicitly recognize the value of beavers, or did they just only regard it as a sacred animal that shouldn't be harmed?
Well, that's like a really great question. And, I'm not an expert on indigenous history and culture, but I learned so much researching this book, and it became really important to me to lean into this history and learn as much as I could, because if I may back up a step, I discovered beavers by accident. I was literally out for a walk one day, and I just out with my dog, and I heard this crack, and I just thought, what? I had no idea what that was. And I looked where my dog Coda was pointing and saw this sort of silver gleam through the woods, and that was a beaver pond, and a beaver was swimming back and forth, and she was slamming her tail, trying to get me to get lost. And sure enough, right in front of the bridge, I looked down, and she had built a dam, and it was just incredible. And I just thought, the transformation of the woods that had happened in a matter of days, and the tenacity and sort of this small animal trying to get rid of me, this big mammal, just fascinated me. And I was really hooked. And I just started learning about beavers. But I have to say, I reached out to people around me who might know something about beavers. And the first person I reached out to was a man who had helped me with a lot of kind of work in my yard, and he happened to be a man of Nipmuc descent, and he knew a lot about the native plants, and he knew a lot about the beavers. And in fact, he himself wasn't a beaver trapper, but he told me, there's a lot of beaver trapping going on here, and he encouraged me to actually talk to fur trappers because they knew a lot about beavers. And actually I would learn a lot from local fur trappers about beavers, and I would learn a lot from him. And in a way, you see it in the book, because the book opens with a story of Great Beaver, and I weave in indigenous ecological knowledge about the beaver. And I also profile a fur trapper and take pains to include that history and that knowledge base. But what I would learn is that the indigenous peoples who have always lived here, and I say peoples because there's no monolithic Native American anything, had really different, very sophisticated understandings of the beaver that were regional. So here in the Northeast, where there's a lot of water and a lot of woods, the Algonquin peoples would hunt beaver. They would manage beaver. They would remove beaver at times from places if they wanted to dry areas out for grasslands, or just the same way they would use fire to also manage game and planting areas. They also would, and this man named Dana also taught me this, they put fish weirs in some of the beaver ponds. So they were actually managing beavers as part of their sort of game management and farming practices. Because after a beaver pond recedes, the soil is incredibly rich. So those beaver meadows would be places where they would plant corn. But out west, I would learn, in arid places like the high plains of Montana, peoples like the Blackfeet had strict prohibitions against hunting beaver at all. And this makes sense because in an arid region like the high plains of Montana, later day Montana, beaver manage the water, which brings grass. And the Blackfeet people were dependent on the bison, which are dependent on the grass. And they understood the grassland ecology, that it would be foolish to take out the beaver, who were bringing so much water. So it was a very scientific, understanding of the ecology that was encoded and reflected in a lot of the beaver stories. So it's really interesting, and it's regional, practices and stories and ideas about beaver.
So I'm going to get now to a very, very local perspective on this. So as someone who grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, and I'm guessing that some of you grew up in Concord, Massachusetts. So back when I was growing up, we never had beavers in Massachusetts, and we never had beavers in Concord. And so how did the beavers get here? Were they come on their own, or they were brought here by the state government?
Yeah. Well, yeah, the state brought them back. It's all a conspiracy. No, actually, that's a really great question because beavers are like one of our great conservation comeback stories. And, we have so many dark, unhappy stories in our moment. I think beavers are such a story of hope and resiliency that we should own and think about because we almost wiped them out. We over-extracted them through the fur trade. They're part of our dark history of just going through this continent and just, taking resources willy-nilly and not at all thinking about the repercussions of that. But in the early 1900s, people worked very hard to bring beavers back. So the first was New York. In 1905, they brought beavers back to the Adirondack Park. And beavers moved throughout New England. Beavers were brought back to Connecticut in 1914, actually not far from where I lived, which was really fun to discover. And maybe the kind of wackiest seeming reintroduction was in Idaho. In 1948, they parachute dropped 76 beavers in wooden crates to very remote areas. The first one was, of course, called Geronimo. And they like really worked hard to figure out how to get these beavers back into arid areas. No one was exactly sure the fate of these beavers. Everybody said, yeah, they were fine, but I don't think they were really monitored. But this year, I actually looked up and found an article. NASA has a special wing that actually is studying the ecology of our planet. And they have satellite imagery. They had a program where they went back and they said, let's go check Idaho. Whatever happened to those beavers that were dropped in 1948? And sure enough, the satellite imagery in January 2024 revealed that Bow Creek, where they dropped those beavers, is a green refugia in an otherwise really dry area. So the beavers must have thrived, must have prevailed, and did what beavers are meant to do, which is restore the hydrology of a dried out area. Because what happened in a lot of the areas out west is when they were over-trapped, then the beavers really couldn't restore themselves to the watersheds on their own. And so that was the thinking behind bringing beavers back. So it's really kind of fantastic that those efforts were made. And now we have a lot of beavers. Nobody's sure exactly how many. Some people say way too many, because beavers can be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
So what I was wondering is, the state brought them in. Now the beavers are moving on their own. Do people also playing a role in this? Do you think there are actually people out there that are moving around beavers from place to place? And also, are there, for example, Native Americans who are bringing them onto their land deliberately?
Well, out west, some really important beaver restoration efforts are being led by indigenous groups. So in California, the first translocation of beavers in 75 years just happened in December, which is really exciting. And it happened in the Mountain Maidu traditional lands. And those 7 beavers seem to be doing really well. And in Washington State and in Oregon, Utah, there are really strong programs to relocate beavers. And the thinking is, if you have a problem beaver in a lowland area, move it up to an upper watershed area where there aren't people, where there's not a problem, and let's get the beavers working there. So in those states, it's not against the law to relocate or translocate beavers. Unfortunately, here in the East, it is against the law. So it's not legal to do it. So if people are doing it, they're doing it without permission. Although in the UK and in Europe, there are efforts to rewild beavers. And there's a famous guy, Gerhard Schwab in Bavaria, who's called the Johnny Appleseed of beavers. And he's been relocating beavers like all over Europe surreptitiously for a long time. And he's quite open about it. No one's caught him yet, but I don't think it would be a good policy here. I'm not trying to encourage that here. So,
I think we've been talking about the benefits of beavers. Can you just describe, some situation where beavers would absolutely not be appropriate, in some situation in your experience where beavers just did some outrageous things where they really had to be removed? For example, I mean, are there examples of like beavers in downtown Manhattan, for example?
Yeah. Well, that would be fun. I know a couple years ago they actually walked into a Toronto subway station and stopped the subways for a while. But I think because it's kind of fun for people to think about wildlife, often when beavers create problems, my personal perspective is they get exaggerated. So if beavers flood a road, there'll be a lot of people like, oh, we got to get rid of the beavers. And then you find out, 3 weeks later, there's a huge rain event and that road was flooded anyway. So, beavers are needed to restore not just the hydrology of the river system so that we can prevent bigger floods and drought, but also biodiversity. This is another aspect of what beavers do that hasn't been talked about as much, but I think it should be talked about and will be soon. So water in a beaver wetland, study after study has shown it has something like 15 times more plankton than water from a wetland without beavers. So you just go up from there, and something like 30% more animal and plant species are located or identified at beaver ponds. And I think people who have seen beaver ponds have observed this. There's a lot of animal and bird life around a beaver pond. So they're called a keystone species by wildlife biologists because they are so important to the larger ecology. And so I think where beavers are problematic is when they start doing things like flooding septics or flooding, infrastructure. So there may be situations where you can't level that pond and those beavers just can't be there because they're not going to stop.
So you've actually referred to leveling pond a few times. Can you just explain to people very, very briefly what a pond leveling device is?
Yeah, and I should say...
Because actually we have them in Concord. So in Concord here, a number of the ponds have pond leveling devices, like Punkatacid. But go ahead. So
I think the term now, rather than speaking just about pond leveling, is coexistence strategies. So, and I back up a step. It was actually the Penobscot Nation up in Maine. It was the largest landowner, I think, in history to actually say, we're not going to use lethal force to control our beavers. We're actually going to go in, and it was in the 1990s, and we're going to actually we're going to work with this man then named Skip Lyle, who's still working today, and we're going to put basically huge pipes through the dam and put a kind of trap over each end so that the beavers can't swim through and other wildlife can't swim through, and kind of trick the beavers. There's a permanent hole in the dam, so they get used to the water going down, and then the dam doesn't flood over. So they're called pond levelers often. They have other names, beaver deceivers, caster master. People have different code names. And different parts of the country were developing this technology at the same time. Up in Canada, people have been working on this as well. The idea is that you just put a permanent hole in the dam. Beavers will get used to the water going down. As long as their pond isn't drained, they don't panic and try to build more dams. But it has to be done carefully, because if the beavers feel threatened, they will start building more dams, and then that's really counterproductive because then they just flood more water. So it's usually better to get a trained person in to do it rather than try to do it yourself, because they know exactly how many feet out to put the pipe, et cetera, et cetera. But does that answer your question?
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah.
So I want to just change the topic slightly here. So a very important part of your book, and a very interesting part of your book that many people don't know about, is the fact that fur trapping is actually actively going on in the United States. There is an active fur trapping community. They are trapping animals and they are selling the fur. But one of the things which was very surprising to me about that was the fact that the price of furs that you describe in your book is very low. So the fur trappers are out there trapping animals like beaver and foxes and coyotes, often with a lot of work and spending a lot of time skinning the animals, but then they're selling them at just these extremely low prices. So you spend a lot of time hanging out with fur trappers. So what is motivating them if it's not the money? Or maybe it is the money, but I mean, what do you think is motivating people to be out there still carrying out this tradition of fur trapping under the present economic circumstances?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was one of the questions I had that I wanted to answer as an animal lover. Like, why does this make sense to someone? Why is this so important that people really are passionate about it? And, you know, I was lucky to be mentored about beavers by a really kind of amazing person that I write about. His name is Herb Sabansky, who's sadly no longer alive. But I think one of the things I learned from Herb was that for him, it was not about the money. It was really about a relationship with the natural world. And it was a very different kind of relationship with the natural world that I wanted to have, or that I had, but it was very strong and very compelling. And I think in this day and age where so many people are disconnected from nature, I began to feel that if anybody gets out into the woods hunting or trapping, being there, connected, for him, I think it was this ancient relationship to being in nature as a kind of hunter-gatherer, like the natural world as a source of food. I just didn't think I could judge that. And I think it was very meaningful. And many of the trappers that I met, who I considered quite ethical, described it as a very spiritual experience. And they knew the animals really, really well and the woods really well.
So in your book, you're describing trapping in Connecticut and other places, but is trapping going on in Massachusetts? I'm guessing it does, but can you tell us if you know anything about it?
Well, I think certain types of trapping have actually been banned here in Massachusetts, but it's complicated because when animals need to be removed, they are trapped in cages, and then they still have to be killed. So it's not that the animals go somewhere, they're actually just killed out of sight. And in a way you can argue it's not very productive, because whereas a fur trapper before might have harvested the fur and the meat, now the animal is just thrown away. And the animals can be trapped anytime. Whereas before there was a season, and most of the fur trappers that I know in Connecticut won't trap in summer because that's when the kits are in the lodge and they say it's really cruel. They don't want to trap beaver when there are young that need to be cared for. A nuisance trapper can trap anytime. So if you trap a beaver in summer and there are young in the lodge, they're going to starve. So which is more humane gets kind of complicated.
I was a little bit intrigued in your book when you're talking about these sort of fur sales events, that people are buying furs. I was having trouble imagining who is actually using these furs. So who's actually buying the furs from the fur trappers, and what are they actually using these furs for in present day America or in other countries?
I think there's not much of a market left. I actually noticed online that Stetson, you know, the cowboy hat, Stetson, I mean, in the 1500s, everybody needed a beaver felt hat. And beaver felt made out of this incredible fur that the beaver have, which is barbed. So it makes this extraordinary felt, was like the Gore-Tex of its day. But I noticed that Stetson now is selling beaver felt hats on their site. And they're made from they're finding old beaver felt hats and somehow reconditioning them. So there's still like a market for that. Pool tables are sometimes made with beaver felt if they can find it. And I came up from New York City the other weekend, and I drove through Williamsburg, and there are a lot of Hasidic community. The men wear the stremmel, which is made out of either beaver fur or fisher. So there are isolated pockets of fur consumers, but in general, I think there's not much of a market. And the North American fur auction that I write about has actually gone bankrupt. That's the last vestige of the Hudson's Bay Company. That went bankrupt. So there's only one fur sale left in North America up in Winnipeg. So it's not a big market anymore.
In your book, you describe a number of people in the past who were really extremely fond of beavers and loved beavers and actually had beavers as pets. And they wrote books about their experiences with beavers. So is the type of beaver that you would observe, or beavers being raised as pets in your home, do you think that gives you insight into what wild beavers are doing?
Well, you're talking about Dorothy Richards.
That's right.
So I hope some of you will read Beaver Sprite. And I write about this amazing woman named Dorothy Richards, who actually was one of the first beaver advocates. She founded the first beaver sanctuary, certainly in the East, maybe in the country. And she started this in 1931 up in Little Falls, New York, southern Adirondacks. And she also discovered beavers kind of by chance, but she really became fascinated by them. And in 1938, she actually petitioned to the state to take 2 kits into her house so she could better study them. And the state gave her permission. And that was the beginning. So she would end up having, at one point, 14 beavers living in her farmhouse with her.
So I just mentioned that she was having a very good experience with them. I mean, they were very tame and friendly, right?
Well, she became very close with them, and she spent her life studying them. She would let people she really made it her mission to educate people about beavers. And she wrote a book called Beaver Sprite, which I encourage anybody interested in beavers and citizen science to read. And what's interesting to me about Dorothy Richards is that in her time, she was considered crazy. She was called the Beaver Lady. And her observations about beavers, she said that they don't just build dams in a kind of instinctive way, pick up a stick, drop it, build it, but they actually can reason. She said they have emotional lives, they have a sense of humor, they expressed kind of joy, and they would play tricks on her. One of them was she had oriental rugs, and when they wanted to play a trick on her, they would start pulling it toward she had like a little swimming pool for them. They would start pulling it toward the swimming pool as if like they're gonna pull it in there because they knew that would upset her. And then when she put her foot on it and said no, they would like put their arms up and wave them and start chuckling. And what's really interesting, at the time people were like, oh yeah, but now that people are really studying beavers with, robot beaver cameras and sophisticated equipment, they're observing beavers show these behaviors, and that when beavers are happy with one another, they do that behavior, and that they also seem to enjoy playing tricks on one another. And when they do that, they kind of put their arms up and sort of giggle like that. So what she was observing was true. She was a citizen scientist. It's just that she was a woman ahead of her time and she had no training. And people said, you're too emotionally close, so this can't be scientific. And I think this is also interesting because now we have wonderful animal behaviorists like Franz de Waal, doing this incredible research about capuchin monkeys. We know octopi dream. We know all kinds of things about the emotional lives of dogs. So it's not surprising to us to think that beavers would have a kind of more sophisticated social life and have emotions. But back when she was writing about it, people were like, no. And the other thing is, I write about Dr. Jordan Kennedy, this really interesting researcher who I think is starting to crack the code about beaver intelligence. But she also really claimed that beavers were making on-site choices, much more sophisticated than people were giving them credit for, about where they built and how.
In the book, you also described a couple that was also feeding beavers, and I was imagining whether they were doing something which was very helpful to the beavers and making the beavers stronger or making the beavers dependent. And I was thinking for people in Concord here, I mean, do we want to encourage people to go out and start feeding beavers in Concord and the surrounding communities with corn and other things? Or is that something where it's better to leave the beavers alone and in the wild?
I think it's actually a really good question. I was at a conference this November called the annual State of the Beaver Conference. There's actually a conference for beavers. And there's actually one in Europe that happens as well. But these conferences have been going on for over 10 years. And this topic came up because I've been monitoring a beaver site here, and I've been watching a pair of young beavers who are just 2 years old really try to surmount difficulties and go out there and pond and get started, and they just keep having trouble after trouble. And I was talking to some researchers about it, and they were saying, get out there and help them out. You should be doing a beaver dam analog. You should be supporting what they do. And it really went counter to my training, which was leave wildlife alone. But they were saying, what are you talking about? They're living in a human-altered environment. They have a very limited source of food. The types of trees that they have to build with, is probably like 4 or 5 compared to the 20 or 25 that they probably need. And it just was kind of a light bulb moment for me to answer your question about, everything is changing very fast as climate accelerates. We are having to deal with different kinds of weather patterns. Wildlife is having to deal with different weather patterns. So I watched these 2 young beavers build an extremely beautiful setup. And then we had this scalding rain event in September that wiped it out. And I thought, oh, too bad, they just didn't build it strong enough. But then later I thought, well, maybe I wish I had helped support it in some way. And out west they would do that. They would support beaver structures now to help them be more resilient. And their point is, beavers aren't used to those kind of rain events, just the way we aren't either. So I think it's a new question. I'm not advising people to go start feeding beavers, McDonald's or corn or something, but I think we need to start thinking in new ways about what we're doing and acknowledge that everybody is trying to survive a very challenging environment out there now.
Okay, so I think at this point we're about to open up for questions, and just to give you an opportunity to formulate your question, I'm going to ask one more brief question of Layla and then open it up. And the brief question that I want to ask for you to answer very briefly is, the topic of the book is Beaverland. Can you just give a very brief definition of what Beaverland is?
Yeah, I told you I was a beaver geek, and I would just go on, sorry. But Beaverland.
One sentence about what is Beaverland.
Yeah. I don't know if I can give you one sentence. You have to read the book. No, Beaverland is really North America when it was full of beavers. We live in Beaverland.
Or you could say Beaverland is North America as it is occupied and modified by beavers.
There you go.
Okay.
But the title of the book came from Herb Sabansky, a fur trapper. I went out with, like the second time I went out with him, he was standing in the swamp, and he just looked out, and he was so much happiness in his voice. He said, "This is Beaverland." And I thought, what's he talking about? But I wrote it down. I thought, I'll figure it out. And I did.
Okay, so at this point, we're going to open it up for people to ask questions of the speaker. Yes, over there. Can you stand up and say your name and then ask your question?
Thank you. I'm Les Kaufman. I know some of you. Layla, everyone knows that above beavers, the most important animals are fish. And I'm wondering if beavers are good or bad for fish.
Well, out west, they say beavers taught salmon how to jump. So I think that's a really good question, and it's a controversial question, because I think the thinking had been that beaver ponds warm the water, and so it's bad for cold water fish like trout or salmon. But I think the story is a lot more complicated than that because beaver wetlands create so much food and refugia, so they're fantastic for out west. They're discovering that where there are beaver dams and beaver wetlands, salmon populations are increasing. So they're actually putting in beaver dam analogs and bringing beavers in for salmon restoration, particularly the indigenous tribes in Washington State, the Tulalip and others are working really actively with beaver for salmon recovery. And I think it's, in cold water, trout need cold water at times, but they also need food. So they probably need the pattern of beaver wetlands plus running water. So I think they're good for fish, but you can't have only beaver wetlands. You also have to have some running water.
Thank you. But if they're good for fish, then they're good.
They're good, yeah.
Yes, over here.
Yeah, they can hear me. Oh, yeah. We've been talking about North America. Are beavers indigenous to other countries?
Oh, yeah, thank you for that question. So, once upon a time, there were beavers the size of bear in the Pleistocene. So there were these really amazing megafauna. And then later, the beavers that we know, the smaller 30 to 50 pound ones, separated into two strands, one in Europe, the Eurasian beaver, and then the North American beaver, Castor, canadensis. So they're native to Europe and going into Eurasia.
Okay, yes, over here.
I'm going to sit because they don't want to block people's view.
Okay.
First, I'm very proud to say that when I was in the Boy Scouts, I was in the Beaver Patrol.
Great.
So the fact that water tables are being depleted all across the continent means that it includes areas where beavers were not indigenous. And I'm wondering if there's any possibility, maybe somebody has done this, where we can artificially manipulate the environment to make it attractive to beavers to settle there and create these ponds.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So that actually is happening. In places where beavers have been missing for a long time, they are going in and putting in what they call beaver dam analogs. And so they're creating, replicating what beavers would have done. I've seen this down in the Chesapeake, and it's pretty incredible. And pretty quickly, the river starts to swell and meander and look something like what beavers would have created. So they can do that. The problem is then they would really like beavers to move in so it's maintained, because otherwise people have to come in and maintain it. But yeah, that's happening in Utah. It's happening in the Chesapeake, Oregon, Washington. It could happen a lot more here in the East, because if you have that water habitat and you plant some fast-growing willows so there's some food, then you have some real estate for beavers.
So back there, maybe?
Who was it?
Hi, thank you. Great talk. Two-pronged. To follow up on the gentleman just asked, I have a similar question, but then I have another Massachusetts question. Thinking for the folks out in the Southwest, do the beavers help bring back water for them? That's my number one question. And he was kind of getting to it, like Arizona, New Mexico, the Colorado Basin, are they helping with that? And then also here you mentioned, well, we're not supposed to, we can't move beavers here in Massachusetts. What about other states in New England, and what has to be done to change that law in Massachusetts?
Oh, okay. So thank you. Great question. So first of all, Colorado has a lot going on working with beavers and river restoration and bringing water back. And Nevada, interestingly, ranchers are working with environmental restoration because they are discovering where there are beavers, they have another month of grass for their cattle. So whereas historically ranchers were at war with beavers, taking them out. Now they're like, how many beavers can you get me? I need water. So I think the light bulb is turning on about the value of beavers, and in Nevada, there's quite a bit. New Mexico has a very strong beaver coalition. And here in the East, there's a wonderful organization called the Beaver Institute, and they have national working groups working throughout the country. They have a goal of having someone on the phone within 2 hours of every beaver problem throughout the entire country, so that if you're in any state, you can call the Beaver Institute and say, hey, I got beavers flooding my septic, what can I do? And they can help to try and help people with coexistence and problem solving, but also they are working on that problem right now. What can people do to change policy so that there's better beaver management?
Is it a matter of contacting our state reps, our state senators to get them to work on it? Are they not going to work on it? Have they tried to work on it?
Yeah, I think what I would suggest is contacting something like the Beaver Institute and find out what they're trying to do and see what they suggest about supporting. Because I think they have, they've got people working on what to do, on what makes sense, and maybe what legislators are sympathetic and how to go forward. I know in Oregon, they just passed a really important bill that now is, I think they've set aside $1.5 million to help landowners with coexistence. So if I have a problem with beavers, I can actually get state money to help me address it. Same in California. And there was a legislator, Pam Marsh, who was responsible for that. So, they're often key people it'd be helpful to know in every state who might be sympathetic and working on it.
Hi, Leila. Question. I'm John, and could you touch a little bit on the historical significance, not only with John Jacob Astor and that whole thing, but way back? You talk a lot about sort of the iconography of beavers and the significance in medieval times and previous to that. Do I have that right? I mean.
Yeah.
And I'm also curious about what you think the source of that mythological relationship to beavers are.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, I think it's because they go into the water where we can't follow them, and then they're on land with us. So they're creatures maybe like frogs in a way, where we sort of, we see what they do, but we can't really follow them. I think that's part of their fascination for me. I mean, I grew up on a farm, spent a lot of time swimming in the pond. Like, one of the great gifts of growing up on a farm is you're hot and bored. You end up in the pond. And I think frogs always fascinated me for that same reason. They were like with us on land, and then you kind of swim with them, and then they disappear. But beavers had a historic value to people back in medieval times medicinally, because the castor, they have internal glands, castor, they communicate through scent, which is the castor oil that they use to create scent mounds. And so very early on, people used it for medicinal purposes, and it did have some medicinal aspects because like willow, it had some kind of aspirin-like analgesic properties. So it probably did have some pain-killing properties, but then it built from there. So by the time of Pliny, beaver castor could cure insanity or epilepsy or headaches, everything, blindness, you got it. So beaver castor was this really valuable medicinal kind of material. And then I think people had a lot of fun imagining beavers. So I have illustrations of beavers in my book, and they were depicted in all kinds of fantastic ways throughout history. Anatomically, not at all what people would have seen. So you kind of wonder where they got a blue beaver or a beaver that looked like a wolf, or it's just interesting. I think it's really interesting. But certainly they have fascinated the human imagination on every continent that they've been found. And I do think it has something to do with the going into the water and coming back on the land, and maybe with something to do with the fact that we once came from the water. Maybe there's some kind of atavistic body memory. I'm not sure.
So could I just add something, which is that one thing which is quite surprising about beavers is that they were really one of the key commodities which was found in North America, which had great value. And so that was actually driving a lot of the economy of the colonies, but also providing the impetus for people to explore further west in the continent. So that was actually driving the people who were at the very edge of the frontier outward to find new beaver territories. So it was extremely important in the early history of the colonies.
Yeah, I mean, the first currency in North America was the beaver dollar, which was literally a token. Everything was about, a rifle, a blanket, anything was, how many beaver pelts was it worth? To the extent that they got sick of carrying around the beaver pelts and they made tokens, brass tokens. I have pictures of them in the book. So yeah, it was really incredibly important. And our first multimillionaire, John Jacob Astor, which John mentioned, he got his start selling beaver pelts on the wharfs of Manhattan. And then he goes west and he founds the first Western port, starting a global trading empire, really. And he names it after himself, Astoria, which becomes Astoria, Oregon. So it's kind of this fantastic story of westward expansion and, but it was basically beaver that helped jumpstart the engines of capitalism in the 19th century. So, beavers have borne a lot of history on their backs. Some of it helpful to us, not helpful to them.
So Allison, do we have time for more questions, or?
I think we're at time.
Okay. So what do we do now?
Now we say thank you to both of you. This was incredible.